Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay, I'm ready. I was not feeling well past 2 days. I didn't make any videos. I felt awful. I'm ready. Ready to learn, getting back into Alexander. I've finished 2. I'd recommend watching the previous 2 before this one, but that is obviously up to you. Let's do it. Gonna face down Darius, I think. Get ready to learn. I'm ready. Phone's away. If you're not ready, there's the door. Let's go.
Alexander crossed the Hellespont in 334 BC and launched an invasion of the mighty Persian Empire. Soon after, he crushed a provincial Achaemenid army at the Battle of the Granicus, leaving all of Asia Minor ripe for conquest. However, before the Macedonian army could push deeper into Darius's empire and face down its giant armies, it would have to deal with a number of stubborn cities on the Aegean coast loyal to the great king. It was time to prove whether the military machine created by Philip could handle a siege. Join kings and generals in this 3rd episode of our series, covering the sieges of Miletus and Halicarnassus. One of the most iconic events in the campaigns of Alexander is his cutting of the Gordian knot.
That's cheating.
Which shows decisiveness in the face of a difficult-to-solve situation. The sponsor of this video, Kamikoto, provides great Japanese steel knives to solve every cooking situation in a decisive fashion. Tapping into more than 800 years of traditional techniques from Japan and using only Japanese steel, Kamikoto created perfect steel knives for your culinary needs. Each Kamikoto knife goes through a rigorous 19-step process that takes several years from start to finish to complete. Each knife is individually
Guys, if you're thinking about getting these knives, make sure to use the /Kings and Generals. It helps them out.
Inspected and comes with a lifetime guarantee. Because of their single bevel edge, Kamikoto knives can achieve an unbelievably sharp edge you just can't get with other knives, and they're used by several chefs working at Michelin star restaurants. We can't recommend Kamikoto knives enough. They were kind to send us a set, and we can definitely say that their knives were the best we've ever used. The knives are very sharp and balanced, while the handles sit well in the hand, making cutting easy and comfortable. The knives arrive in—
Did you guys know that the Michelin stars and the Michelin tire company are one and the same, and that it started off as like a travel book guide?
A beautiful case and have a lifetime guarantee, making them a great gift option for the holiday season. Kamikoto has an excellent offer for Kings and Generals fans. Go to kamikoto.com/kingsandgenerals and use our discount code kingsandgenerals to get $50 off any purchase that you make. Reports of what had occurred at the Granicus reverberated throughout Asia Minor with prodigious speed and to immediate effect. At Ephesus, the mercenary garrison, together with one of Alexander's exiled court rivals, Amnitus, seized a pair of warships and abandoned their post, making their way to the great king's court. Marching from Sardis, the victorious Macedonian king captured Ephesus without resistance after a 3-day march, before rendezvousing with his navy and receiving emissaries from other Lydian towns offering submission. Intent on securing his conquests before advancing inland, Alexander appointed Parmenion and Alcimachus each a contingent of several thousand troops and sent them off to assure the capitulation of settlements throughout Ionia, Lydia, and Aeolia. Their remit was clear. Greek cities were to have democratic governments installed, oligarchies were to be deposed, local customs were to remain unchanged, and crucially, taxes cancelled, a gesture which never hurts a new ruler's popularity. At this point, while he was concluding affairs in Ephesus, Alexander received a number of important messages in quick succession. First came welcome reports that the governor of Miletus, Hegesistratus, was prepared to surrender his city. Then came the definitely less welcome news that a massive Achaemenid war fleet had been spotted near Rhodes.
Memnon. I feel like that's such a cool name. Memnon.
On its way to reinforce
Rhode Island?
the massive Achaemenid war fleet had been spotted near Rhodes on its way to reinforce the area. Finally, sometime later, Alexander got wind that Hegesistratus, newly inspired by the knowledge that reinforcements were en route, had recanted his surrender. Realizing he had to act swiftly to prevent the city becoming a nigh impregnable Persian fortress, Alexander sent riders to recall his generals and then immediately marched south with what soldiers he had. The king's Hellenic League fleet of about 160 ships was sent ahead. Racing along the coast, it succeeded in arriving at Miletus before the incoming enemy fleet was anywhere close, where it set down anchor at the adjacent island of Ladi. Not long thereafter, Alexander arrived with the army and occupied Miletus's landward outer suburbs without resistance, before establishing a blockade of the inner districts. Then, to reinforce his anchored fleet at Ladi, the king further fortified the island with Thracian skirmishers and a few thousand mercenary soldiers. The massive Persian fleet finally approached Miletus a full 3 days after the Greek fleet had made its base at Ladi. However, despite a numerical superiority of more than 2 to 1, and the Empire's expert...
I just want to say, guys, so you see it's the Siege of Halicarnassus. This channel is so good at giving you an overview with broader maps and slowly going in and in and in until that music starts and the siege starts. Phenomenal. Okay. Sorry.
A numerical superiority of more than 2 to 1, and the Empire's expert Phoenician and Cypriot crews, the Persians realized they would not be able to dislodge Alexander's navy from Ladi, nor easily deploy troops to bolster Miletus's defense.
Sorry, guys.
The Persians realized they would not be able to dislodge Alexander's navy from Ladi, nor easily deploy troops to bolster Miletus's defense. The 400 Persian ships were therefore forced to circumvent the Hellenic navy and anchor at an exposed suboptimal position off Mount Mycale, further from the city and cut off from any source of fresh water by parties of Macedonian cavalry. Making the decision to keep his inferior fleet on the defensive at Ladi, Alexander began readying his siege weaponry and infantry to breach the city fortifications. As the king's preparations were nearing completion, a prominent citizen came out on behalf of the mercenary garrison to parley. According to this messenger, the garrison offered Miletus as an open city, open to both Persians and Alexander alike, if only the siege was lifted. Alexander's unimpressed response was simple: prepare yourselves for the fight. At dawn the following day,
What kind of offering is that? It's like they're here for a battle, and you're like, well, we're going to be open to both sides, and it's like, no.
Parmenion and Alcimachus returned, allowing an assault. Macedonian ballistae and catapults began hammering the fortifications, clearing sections of the wall, and inflicting structural damage, while battering rams advanced to create breaches up close. The main body of infantry was drawn up as this assault was ongoing, standing ready in preparation to rush in and widen any gap in the Milesian defences. However, due to the strength of the garrison and abundance of missile fire, the initial Macedonian attack was blunted with relative ease. Arrian relates how the nearby Persian navy, although unable to resist, were close enough to see Alexander's men advancing against their isolated allies across the bay with the naked eye. As time went on, the land attack gradually began making progress. Small punctures were made, missile stores ran low, and the defenders were placed under ever-increasing pressure. All that the Macedonians required was something to tip the scales, and Miletus would be theirs. Seeing that the king had launched his assault from the land, Admiral Nicanor embarked his ships from Ladi and sailed them into the Milesian harbour mouth, tightly packed in an ostensible attempt to prevent any Persian move to relieve the city. It had a far greater effect than that. With their walls near crumbling under Alexander's assault, this quasi-attack prompted a total collapse. The Macedonian army subsequently managed to get inside the city, primarily killing soldiers, but also civilians who might have been in the way. Of the Milesian defenders, just 300 mercenaries and a scattering of other warriors managed to escape to a steep-sided islet slightly offshore. When they surrendered soon after, Alexander granted them the mercy he had learned at the Granicus. The citizens who had survived the brief spate of violence were also left alone. Unable to prevent the fall of the city it had come to reinforce, and successfully prevented from foraging ashore, the still formidable Persian fleet sailed to Samos, restocked with whatever they needed, and then returned to Miletus, looming in open water close to the harbour entrance. 5 Persian vessels were sent as bait to lure Alexander onto the open sea.
Question, guys: when was the first sort of? I should have asked this before. The first, like, so they had the engineering skills to develop these large, like catapults and whatnot, and so, like, when was the first one of those created? You know, like a trebuchet catapult type thing.
But a
It
swift
seems pretty
hit-and-run
advanced
assault
for the
by 10
time.
Greek triremes destroyed one of them and sent the other 4 running back to the main fleet. Unable to accomplish anything of use, the great king's armada weighed anchor and sailed south to Halicarnassus. With Miletus conquered, it was at this moment in mid to late 334 that Alexander made the strategic decision to disband his fleet. Not only would such an unconventional course of action relieve Alexander of having to bear the massive cost required to maintain said ships, but in truth, he did not totally trust their Greek crews. Moreover, the king was pragmatic enough to realize that he could never hope to match Darius's naval strength on the water with or without a fleet of his own.
So I had the false impression, I guess I shouldn't have, that at this time the Greek lands were pretty much behind Alexander, but that's not the case.
Just 20 Athenian triremes were retained to ferry the army's siege engines. Based on his army's pitched battle at the Granicus and siege at Miletus, Alexander judged that investing everything in a land campaign was his best shot at success. His army was master of the continent, and now there was no way to retreat. Its troops would fight on even harder. Still, Persian seaborne might was a firm threat that had to be dealt with, or it might expand the war to a second front in Greece, or even inspire rebellions at home. So, rather than attempting to oppose Achaemenid naval hegemony in the eastern Mediterranean by vainly headbutting it with ships of his own, Alexander instead devised a plan to conquer the ships from the land. He would embark on a Herculean endeavor within his already titanic campaign, marching inexorably down the Mediterranean coastline and capturing coastal cities from which the Persian navy operated. The first victim of Alexander's new strategy would be Halicarnassus, where Mausolus's eponymous mausoleum was constructed a few decades earlier. Set in a natural amphitheater, Halicarnassus was heavily fortified, possessed a fantastic harbour, and had its garrison swollen by native troops, alongside several thousand mercenaries under Memnon of Rhodes's command. This Greek general, who had risen to new heights following the Granicus debacle, was now Darius's official commander of Achaemenid efforts.
Memnon sent his wife and children to the great king at this point as good faith hostages and for their safety.
In the western satrapies. En route to this showdown with
Good faith hostages, meaning, does that mean, like, showing the king there, like, hey, if I do anything wrong, you have my wife and kid. Obviously, if I'm sending my wife and kid to you, then I don't plan on betraying you or whatnot. Is that what that means?
Memnon, Alexander stopped at the greatest fortress in the region, Alinda, and was introduced to the exiled Princess Ada, Mausolus's sister. Until just a few years before the Macedonian invasion, this region of southwestern Asia Minor, known as Caria, had been ruled by a native dynasty known as the Hecatomnids, who were in turn autonomous satraps within the Persian Empire. Ada, a Hecatomnid princess, had been the rightful heir before being deposed and exiled by her brother Pixodarus in 340. He died a few years later, allowing the Persians to marry the late dynast's daughter.
Pixodarus was essentially in bed with the Persian regime by the end of his reign and had his daughter marry Orontabades, who seems to have been a Persian stooge groomed for this purpose.
To Orontabetes and install him as satrap. Now, Ada asked the king for aid in taking back her rightful position. By accepting this plea, Diodorus Siculus tells us that Alexander won allegiance from many of the Carian cities. The king subsequently moved on Halicarnassus and approached the city, guarded as it was by crenellated walls and
I feel so stupid. I sort of...
Halicarnassus, and approached the city, guarded as it was by crenellated walls and fronted by a large encircling moat from the northeast. Alexander encamped half a mile from the eastern Mylasa gate and began preparing the siege. However, Persian naval supremacy had succeeded in preventing the Macedonian siege train from landing, so Alexander was forced to improvise until it managed to do so. Mounting his steed, Alexander led a scouting party forward to have a look at the formidable defences they faced. Memnon was on him in an instant. When this scouting force approached, the Greek general had his archers and artillery fire upon the Macedonians from his walls. Then, not giving the invaders a second, he led a sortie of skirmishers out to niggle at Alexander's men with javelins and other missiles. A quick counterattack by the king managed to drive them back inside Halicarnassus, but Alexander nevertheless pulled back to camp. Several days after this initial probe, Alexander assembled his usual crack force of companions, Hypaspists and Agrianes, supplemented them with 3 phalanx regiments, and led them around to the western gate. While his primary aim in this endeavour was to scout out this side of Halicarnassus, there had also been whisperings from sympathizers inside the nearby port, Myndus, that the city would be surrendered if Alexander came to take it that night. Its possession would make seizing Halicarnassus that much easier. Under the cover of darkness, Alexander's forces approached Myndus at midnight and waited, and waited, and waited some more.
Sorry if you can hear some construction noises, guys. It seems you're good.
Myndus at midnight and waited, and waited, and waited some more. There was no sign of the surrender that the Macedonians had been promised. Unwilling or unable to abandon the gambit entirely, Alexander began sapping the walls in an effort to take the town by force. One of Myndus's guard towers fell with relative speed, but the prepared garrison fiercely resisted until reinforcements arrived from Halicarnassus by sea. Having been prepared to simply walk into Myndus, Alexander wasn't ready for another extended siege and so withdrew to the Mylasa gate, rejoining the bulk of his army. In what was a truly fortunate twist of fate, 20 Athenian triremes bearing Alexander's siege train managed to evade Memnon's ships and unload the city-taking weaponry in a nearby cove. After a rocky start, things were at last looking up for the Macedonians. As the siege engines were made ready, Alexander sent his soldiers under the...
Also those siege towers, which the first time I ever saw those was in Lord of the Rings Return of the King, and I thought it was just a construct of Tolkien or something, but those were real things, and it's amazing they were able to move them. They must have had ox or something, and
cover of portable roofed sheds to fill in large sections of the outer trench with earth and stones. Engines were made ready. Alexander sent his soldiers under the cover of portable roofed sheds to fill in large sections of the outer trench with earth and stones. With the ground prepared, the first proper assault on Halicarnassus could begin in earnest. While trundling siege towers and artillery were used to batter the fortifications, battering rams and mining operations gradually undermined sections of the East Curtain Wall. When the Macedonian undermining efforts managed to collapse a section of wall or bring down a tower, Alexander would throw his infantry at the section in an attempt to secure a breach. The Macedonian soldiery fought exceptionally well in these engagements, as they always would, but Memnon's equally disciplined Greek mercenaries, supplemented by thousands of native troops and wall archers, managed to keep the invaders at bay with relative ease. So far,
guys, every time I hear the word Greek, it floods me with confusion. I know it's Macedonia, and Macedonia and Greece clearly aren't the same thing, and mercenaries tend to come from both sides, fighting for both sides, and I see that in other videos about other figures. But I forget what was my point.
But Memnon and his command council quickly understood that their enemy's efforts were destroying the walls with disconcerting efficiency.
Oh right, yeah. Just I'm still Still, obviously, Alexander doesn't have... It just seems strange that he's extending outside of Greece before he even has all of Greece cemented under him. And he must have a reason.
A proactive stance had to be made to prevent disaster. So that same night, while builders worked to patch up the previous day's damage with makeshift secondary fortifications, a commando unit of Halicarnassus' defenders, under Memnon, slipped out of the Carian capital unnoticed and quietly approached the dormant Macedonian siege machines. Getting close, the Greek general attempted to burn down and destroy Alexander's towers, rams, and artillery pieces. Unfortunately for his raiding party, its presence was discovered by sentinels who quickly sounded the alarm. Macedonian reinforcements converged, and a blind, desperate clash in the dark ensued. Beleaguered, unsuccessful, and having lost 170 men killed, Achaemenid forces were eventually forced into retreat. But the hard nighttime struggle had also resulted in 300 Macedonian wounded.
Imagine the smell after a few days, like all these like sweaty guys and like dead bodies all over the place, and feces and especially after a few days and like sun. Oh.
Suffered such casualties, neither side made a move for several days and were temporarily content to lick their wounds. This state of affairs apparently changed 3 days later at the behest of 2 rowdy Macedonian infantrymen from Perdiccas' regiment. In the process of drinking together, each man boasted of his exploits and declared how brave they were. Amusingly, and almost certainly because of Dutch courage, the contest escalated into the 2 enterprising warriors taking up their weapons and moving out, intent on putting words into action.
Really?
Perhaps somewhat bemused by the odd attack, some guards saw the Macedonians coming and sallied out to assail them, but were in turn killed and driven back by the partially inebriated warrior.
No way! These guys getting drunk, bragging, and then eventually going out and are actually doing something.
Made aware that some of their comrades were in danger, more men from Perdiccas' regiment marched to the fight, drawing even more defenders. This haphazard engagement grew and grew until the Macedonians eventually drove the defenders against the half-destroyed Melassa section of the wall. Suddenly, with the eastern fortifications in such a bad state, it seemed as though Alexander's forces might actually get into the city on the back of this deadly drunken brawl. Unfortunately for the troops who started the whole debacle, Halicarnassus' surprise was matched by most of the Macedonian army, which, being unaware of what was actually happening, did not press the attack in time, and Perdiccas' men were repelled. Alexander's late intervention prevented their destruction. To protect the area, Memnon had a crescent brick wall built, but this slapdash measure was clearly a weakness.
I really
Still,
wanted
the
that.
whimsical nature of this event disguises the fact that it was a lethal clash that claimed the lives of many on both sides. So many Macedonians were killed, in fact, that Alexander sent a herald forward to ask for a truce so bodies might be recovered. 2 of Memnon's Athenian comrades, Ephialtes and Thrasybulus, advised their leader to deny this request. Memnon, in a move which allows us to see some of the man's honourable character, allowed it anyways. No real timescale is given by which we can judge the siege for sure, but the defenders had managed to hold the city for at least several weeks. However, if matters continued as they were, the Achaemenid generals believed that Halicarnassus would fall. In a final gambit that must have made Alexander blush.
I really wanted that drunken that to actually result in the falling of the city.
Would fall. In a final gambit that must have made Alexander blush even as it made him bleed, Memnon sent 2,000 men under Ephialtes through the Melassa gate during one of the Macedonian attacks. While half formed a phalanx and doggedly held off the king's infantry, the other half wielded brands and caused a great conflagration among his siege engines. Ephialtes' surprise attack, ably assisted by missile fire from the walls, was pushing back Alexander's infantry. The situation became even more critical when Memnon sallied out of the northern gate of the city with Persian reserves.
Guys, I wonder how skilled archers were at long range in terms of, like, they know that their guys are going around to make a maneuver and they have to provide some help. I wonder how much, like, how close, at what distance they can safely fire missiles while helping their attackers while not hitting them, you know, friendly fire.
Striking the Macedonian infantry in the flanks and rear. At this moment, beset on all sides, Theodorus states that even Alexander found himself quite helpless. It seemed as though the Persians were close to achieving a great victory and breaking the siege. However, it was at this final juncture that Alexander's reserve battalion of grizzled veterans.
This unit of the Hypaspis, which would become known as the Silver Shields during the campaign in India, fought on the flanks, but unlike other Hypaspis was unable to storm walls and perform other strategic tasks.
From Philip's era, who were that Alexander's reserve battalion of grizzled veterans from Philip's era, who were ostensibly exempt from combat, locked their shields, lowered their spears, and entered the fray. These elders smashed directly into Ephialtes' spent ranks, an unbreakable shield wall, and ripped them to pieces.
So they already had their pension and retirement, and they went in?
Inspired by this old guard of warriors, the Macedonian soldiers rallied and pressed the assault.
That must have been
pretty crazy. In minutes
crazy.
Following this intervention, the Greek captain Ephialtes and hundreds of his soldiers were slain, leaving the sortie leaderless. Worse still was the psychological effect. The defenders had been on the edge of victory, perhaps of winning the entire war. They were not prepared for another fresh foe, and now they began routing. So panicked were the Halicarnassians at this sudden turn of events that they closed the gates too hastily, trapping a portion of their sally forces outside to be slaughtered against the ruined curtain wall. Over 1,000 of Memnon's troops had been slain in the risky action, and it hadn't paid off. Still, Alexander.
So in my brain, like, I'm thinking, like, I'm removed from the time and I don't know, like, you know, the everything of war, and it must desensitize you. But I'm thinking, like, those people, I'm like, is there a way for them to, like, surrender or something, and not die? But if I'm the attacker, having to deal with a surrendering soldiers during a siege is just going to cause so much effort and anxiety that it's just not worth it, and you just got to slaughter all of them.
Whose cause had been definitively saved by the veteran corps, cautiously pulled back to camp at nightfall. Unknown to him, the siege was over and he had won. Inside the moonlit city, Memnon and Aruntabates took counsel, and taking into account all of their severe losses and the failure of their final gamble, decided to give up a greater part of the city. Memnon installed the best of his remaining soldiers in Halicarnassus' seaboard citadels at Salmacis and the Arcanesi, before loading the remainder onto his anchored and unchallenged navy, together with whatever movable supplies he could get his hands on. Then, in a methodical scorched earth attempt to prevent Alexander from gaining too much from his conquest, the withdrawing Achaemenids set fire to immovable stores,
As
armories,
soon as you see that smoke going up, you gotta imagine, okay, go in,
artillery, and houses next to the walls. It did not seem to have been a vindictive act of wanton destruction against the civilian population, but seasonal autumn winds fanned the flames and led to its spread over great areas of the ancient city. While Memnon raised anchor and embarked, Alexander finally entered the burning city at midnight. At the king's command, Macedonian regiments marched respectfully through the liberated city, rescuing any inhabitant imperiled by the fire and demolishing buildings to create fire breaks. Surveying the still garrisoned fortresses, Alexander had a wall built around Salmacis to prevent any sortie, but found himself unable to do anything about the island's strongpoint of Arcanesi.
For being so young and seemingly, in the first few episodes, a little reckless from my point of view, he is very sort of wise. In a few instances, he showed that he's not just,
leaving 3,000 mercenaries,
not just a very ambitious young warrior. He actually has a lot of brains as well.
And 200 cavalry to mop up on Persian resistance in Caria, Alexander kept his promise and gave Ada the satrapy before preparing to move deeper into Asia Minor. As he did so, the armies of Great King Darius III were finally nearing readiness to the east. In the course of the next year, 333, they would march west to the first great confrontation between the two greatest kings of the age at Issus. Our video on that epic battle is on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing. It helps immensely.
Awesome video, like always, from Kings and Generals. That was one of my favorite videos, I think. I think that might be my favorite out of the 3 so far, and they've been good. Halfway through here, still got 3 more. Awesome, very interesting. Hope you guys can answer my questions. Hope you're all doing well. If not, chin up. You'll be good soon. See you next time.